He's a Taft graduate, a Taft parent, and a highly respected scientist. Dr. Biff Bermingham is the director of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama, where his lab studies the evolutionary biology of neotropical fish and Caribbean birds. He's published more than 135 peer-reviewed articles, edited a book on tropical rainforests, and sponsored about 50 pre- and postdoctoral graduate students. If you want to chat with Dr. Bermingham later, he has generously agreed to have lunch during some of C and D blocks in, I think, lobby dining hall. Thanks.
On a human-dominated planet, we are the single greatest force of evolution. At a time when ecosystem services are essential to our well-being and global change is felt by all, we must understand the complex systems of nature, especially in the tropics where population is exploding and the health of the planet rests. It is more evident than ever how we are all dual citizens of the tropics and the temperate zones. We are all indigenous people.
So I'm going to give you a broader overview than just my own research. When you saw the first banner go across, and it's a reminder to all of us that as people that have largely grown up in the developed world, that the world's great universities are in the temperate zone. And scientists, like humanitarians, do their best work in their own backyards. That means that most of what we know about biology, most of what we know about the natural world, is about the temperate zone, not the tropics. But as you can see from this banner, 80% of biodiversity in the world is located in the tropical zone. And that's where the challenges are going to be in the next century. The last century, obviously, tremendous advances in technology, medicine, etc. And I'm going to submit to you today that if we don't begin to understand something about this tropical world that we live in, where most of our diversity is, the Earth is going to have true challenges in front of us. We, as you heard in the video, we're going from 7 billion to 10 billion people. And the only way that we're going to do that and have a life worth living is if we begin to use science to understand how to take care of the environment. We are on a human-dominated planet, and we must do this. It's also interesting to know why you've got the map of the world up there. If you start to think about agriculture as we go from 7 to 10 billion people, that agriculture, the remaining arable land, is in the tropics. And how we're going to both feed ourselves and have a planet worth living on is truly a challenge. And again, if you think about the fact that all of the world's great universities are in the temperate zone, it's a real challenge. It's a remarkable place. And this is what, when you remember that Panama wasn't a country in 1902. Panama got its independence in 1903 because the United States wanted to build a canal. All right, so why the Smithsonian's in Panama is 100 years ago, slightly more than 100 years ago, the U.S. decided to build a canal in Panama. Helped Panama gain its independence from Colombia and started to construct the Panama Canal. The reason the French, who had really started the Panama Canal, failed was they were beaten by disease, yellow fever and malaria. It's hard to believe, but in the late 1800s, we did not understand that insects, mosquitoes, were the vectors of those two diseases. And so French engineers were dying very rapidly. People thought it owed to swamp miasma. During the Spanish-American War, began to recognize that in fact insects are the vectors for disease. And so when the U.S. built the canal, one of the things that they did intelligently was they brought a group of scientists down to understand particularly something about insects, entomology, but mainly because they were interested in disease. And that was the 1910 to 1912 Smithsonian expeditions to Panama. And 100 years later, we're still there in the institute that I run. So this is a group of the early scientists that were there that recognized they'd never seen tropical biodiversity before. and they were overwhelmed. And this is Barrow, Colorado Island that you see here. This, for most of our history, was where most of our biology was done. It's the largest lake in the Panama Canal. Several of those scientists recognized as the Panama Canal was flooding, what was a mountainside on the edge of the Chagres River would become the largest island in the lake. They petitioned the Canal Zone governor to set it aside as a nature preserve, and that was our origin. That was a very origin more than 100 years ago. Small number of scientists, small number of visitors. As you can see now, I oversee a staff of 46 PhD scientists, about 1,500 visiting scientists a year. We're supported by 400 permanent employees, and we have this spectacular relationship with our host country of Panama. So again, what's amazing about Panama, and you can see it in this photo, to your right. To your right is Colombia, to your left is Costa Rica. Panama connects the two of them. And as you can see, it's both a bridge between South America, Colombia to your right, and Central America, Costa Rica to your left, and a dividing point between the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean. The red dots show the number of field stations that we have in Panama. And it's a remarkable study in evolution. So this isthmus that you're looking at rose about 3 million years ago out of the sea to join South America to North America. And when that happened, you had a biological exchange of epic proportion. Truly, truly spectacular. So many of the things that are quintessentially South American, the big cats, weren't there 3 million years ago. They came out of North America. The camelids, all of these things came out of North America. So most of the mammals that you associate with South America actually came out of North America somewhere between 3.5 to 2.5 million years ago. Freshwater fish, which I study, went the opposite direction. Most of what you see in Central America came out of South America. Trees in both directions, birds in both directions. But it's a natural biological invasion. It's a tremendous opportunity to understand how biodiversity arises through time and what the importance of invasion is in generating diversity. At the same time, you've got fauna and flora moving across the isthmus between South America and North America. You, for the first time ever, have divided that tropical sea, which was a continuous sea, into the Caribbean, modern Caribbean, and Eastern Pacific Ocean. And so for an evolutionary biologist, which is where my roots are, tremendous opportunity to look at how species form. And I'm a molecular geneticist by training, tremendous opportunity to understand something about the molecular basis of species formation. And that's how I spent my early career at STRI, looking at those sorts of things. In the earlier picture of the laboratories on Barrow, Colorado Island, I think one of the things that's tremendous about STRI, and reflects back to my first slide, is that it's North American or US-based science and US-based funding, so developed world funding, supporting that science, but it's laboratories absolutely on the edge of tropical forests and laboratories on the edge of coral reefs. There's no university in North America, there's no university in Europe that is on the edge of coral reefs or on the edge of tropical lowland forests, which is where all the diversity is. And that's why we get 1,500 visitors a year. It's just a spectacular resource for beginning to come to grips with some of the challenges that we have. So now into a little science. You'll see towards the end of the talk that I'm just going to touch on the variety of science we do, but I'm going to focus in on just a couple of points. And one is, why are there so many species of tropical trees? I mean, this is just a general question about biodiversity. And this is work of one of our scientists, Steve Hubble, who a number of years ago came to Panama, went to that island that I showed you earlier, Barrow, Colorado Island, and he said, I want to understand something about tropical tree diversity. I want to understand, why do we have 500 species of trees on that 1,500 hectare island when across all of North America, we've got about 800 species of trees. I mean, how do you explain the tremendous wealth of diversity in the tropics in comparison to the temperate world? And one of the things he realized, and this again goes back to this contrast between universities in the north and the virtual lack of them in the south. People had studied diversity in the tropics. People had gone there, but they'd gone and they'd used the tools of temperate plant ecologists in the tropics. So a temperate plant ecologist will look at a 1 hectare plot to look at the dynamics through time of species and species change. And Steve's insight was, wait a minute, we're in the tropics, the scale is completely different. If we want to understand something about dynamics, we've got to look at much larger plots. And so he developed a 50 hectare plot. We measured, marked, and mapped every single tree in that plot. That's 300,000 stems bigger than my finger, all the way up to things that are about the size of this stage. I mean, huge trees. And then he went back every 5 years. And when he first started that, people, I mean, literally people thought he was nuts. I mean, it took more than a year and a half to measure all those trees, identify them, map them. People were like, what a colossal waste of time. What are you going to learn? We know already that the tropics are stable, the temperate zone is dynamic. There's nothing really to learn there. What Steve showed was that in the next 5-year census, so he went back in 1985, and of those 300 species of trees that he was studying on that plot, 40% of them had statistically changed in number. Okay, so 40% of 300, 120 species of trees. That's more than you've got in the entire state of Connecticut. Had changed and changed in a very dramatic way. Probably owing to an El Nino event where we have drought in Panama when we get El Nino events. Probably owing to that, most of the trees have lost. As a result of that, people around the world said, wait, this guy's onto something. We really need to understand something about this. And so what started out as a single plot on Panama, we now run 47 plots in 21 countries around the world. As you can see there, we're monitoring more than 4 million trees, representing 8,500 species. It's a tremendous data set. And to give you a sense of the quality of the data, again, it goes back to my first slide, we've now published 1,200 papers off of those data. And almost 50 of those have been published, for those of you, any of you who know a little bit about science, 50 of those have been published in the journals of Nature, Science, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. When you publish papers in those what we call high-profile journals, it means they're of general relevance. So we're discovering things about the world that people had no idea about, and they're considered to be, by scientists in general, to be of incredible importance. About a decade ago, more in some places, we started worrying about climate change. And that's about the time that I moved out of my lab and into the administration in charge of direct slide. The great thing about a tree, if you're going back and you're measuring a tree, when you measure a tree, you can use something called an allometric equation to estimate how much biomass is in that tree. And it turns out when you think about a tree's biomass, that 50% of a tree's biomass is carbon. And as humans on this planet, we're interested in carbon. We're interested in how much carbon we emit into the atmosphere and how much carbon we pull out of the atmosphere. And I recognize that because we've been studying these trees through time, across space, both longitudinally and latitudinally, that we had a measure of carbon change through time. So as the climate is changing, as we're increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, which is a fertilizer for trees, right? Trees like CO2. But at the same time, we're increasing temperatures. Photosynthesis tends to be very finicky with regard to temperature, particularly midday temperatures. So the question becomes, how are forests really responding to this great new fertilizer that we're pumping into the atmosphere, but at the same time temperature? And I recognize that with this we had these data. Why is it important? Well, here I've shown you 3 curves. And basically, you're looking out to 2100. And with increasing temperature, we know that oftentimes in the tropics, you exceed a plant's ability to photosynthesize at midday. And so if what happens, if the impact of climate change on tropical forests particularly is negative, so you get reduced carbon assimilation, that curve in the white dots that's shown there. You see where you get to about 1,000 parts per million carbon by the time you get to 2100. On the other hand, if in fact these trees, because we've added this source of carbon into the atmosphere, actually grow more rapidly, then what you see in the red curve is that by the time we get to 2100, we're only at about 700 parts per million carbon. Why does that make a difference? Well, the difference between the red and the white dotted line is about 50 years of anthropogenic carbon emissions to the atmosphere. That gives us a lot of time, or gives science a lot of time, if it's the red curve, to sort of figure out how we're going to deal with climate change. The things that you guys saw in Sandy, we saw in an event called La Purísima in Panama, and that makes a difference. That's the role of science. We observe, but we also build models that allow us to predict the future, and that's important. And that came out of, that's a study that came out of a basic question: why so many tree species in the world? But we then convert it, we pull that knowledge into immediate use to begin to ask questions about how the Earth is responding or acclimating to climate change. We don't have the answer yet. We have actually, it's an interesting, and as always in science, a mixed answer. In the temperate zone, we're clearly seeing faster plant growth. In the tropics, not so fast. And so it's looking somewhere between the red and the white lines. So if you go just a little bit down the canal from where George and I live, this is a landscape that you see. And this is a typical landscape in the tropics now, degraded landscapes. And that group up there in the front row, the only seniors who are here have all seen this. They've all been to Panama. This is a typical scene, and this goes back to my opening comments. The challenge for the next century as we go to 10 billion people is how do we take a landscape like this and turn it back into productivity? And by productivity, I don't necessarily mean corn, I don't necessarily mean soybeans, I don't necessarily mean sugarcane, but I could mean any one of those three. But I also mean clean water, I also mean pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. So how do we turn that into a productive landscape? And I call that the science of sustainability. And Panama is just an absolutely remarkable place to study the science of sustainability and to think, as we go forward, how are we going to manage agriculture, places to live, food, mining. This is something that I fight with my wife all the time. I mean, anybody looks at this environmental destruction and hates it, and then you turn around, and you grab your cell phone out of your pocket, and you want to use that, and you like lights, and you all of a sudden recognize, well, Chinese want to do that as well, Indians want to do that as well, everybody wants the life we have, everybody. And to get that, you're going to have to keep taking copper out of the ground. But we got to do it better. And so all of these things are things that will impact us as human beings. And I think science has a critical and a principal role to play in managing these landscapes in an intelligent way. So I want to give you an example of that. And again, live in Panama. It's a remarkable place. And one of the reasons it's remarkable is shown in this picture. So this is the Panama Canal. That's a container ship going through it. The Panama Canal accounts for 4.5% of global trade. That's a huge, huge number going through the Panama Canal. And that trade depends on fresh water. The Panama Canal is not a sea level canal. It's not like Suez. It's a freshwater canal. You go up 3 stages, get 80 feet above sea level, and then you go back 3 stages to get back down to sea level and take merchandise from Shanghai, China, to New York, and ultimately to Taft School of Shoes and Feet. So hugely important, driven by fresh water. And the distribution of fresh water matters. So fresh water, too much fresh water, is a risk to the Panama Canal. And again, in 2010, we had an event called La Purísima. We had so much rain, in 36 hours that the canal, for the first time in the history of the canal, was closed for natural reasons. So the only other time it's ever closed was when the U.S. invaded Panama. It was closed also for about a day. It was closed because of the storm left releasing it for a day. As you know, in the U.S., we've had our worst weather events in the last decade of the last century. Okay? We are experiencing climate change, and we're experiencing extreme weather events. So on this graph, what I've done is I've shown you two forested catchments. I'm not going to go into all of the detail. The important part is that one of them is 50% deforested and one of them is 100% forested. This is the rainy season in Panama versus the dry season. And what you see is during the rainy season, more water is returned to the Panama Canal in the deforested landscape than in the forested landscape. Very easy to see. That's a time when the canal is at risk. Most of that water going into the Panama Canal then goes straight out to sea. There's too much water. I'll come back to that in a moment. In the dry season, at the end of the wet season, and the dry season, you see the curves invert. And in the dry season, when we need that water, it's the forested landscape that's returning more water. It's something called the sponge effect. And the sponge effect requires forest or clever landscape uses. Pasture land, for example, cows on pasture tend to compact soils. The water runs off the top of it. So why does this make a difference? So we've taken these data, we've built a model. Back to my 2010 La Purísima storm. Most 80% of the water in the Panama Canal flows through something called Chagres National Park, which is largely forested, but because it's not controlled, it's becoming deforested at the edges. We estimated that if Chagres National Park was 50% deforested, like this comparison here, we would have overwhelmed the dam that's above, we would have breached that dam, and we would have likely have breached also the Panama Canal Dam, the dam that forms the actual lake that the ships go through. If that happened, obviously all the water goes out to sea, and even if you could rebuild the principal dam overnight, it would take the Panama Canal 4 years to recharge and permit shipping to go through. So just imagine what that would do to the world economy. And yet we're not really thinking about how we manage forests. And so we've done something that we call smart reforestation. So here's that same landscape again. The challenge for all of us, for all of you, is how do you replant it? And that's a complicated experimental design down in the right-hand corner. But in that design is one tree, teak, which is an exotic plant from India. It's largely planted in Latin America. It turns out teak, to fix 1 gram of carbon, requires about 400 grams of water. There are native species in that same mix, which can fix 1 gram of carbon using about 70 to 100 grams of water. So if you're managing a landscape for both carbon and water, what types of trees you choose is fundamentally important. And then on top of that, if you begin to think about how local cultures use trees, how pollinators use trees, you begin to understand that reforestation is more than just taking the wood that you think might have the highest timber value when you harvest it. Because actually in this particular setting, the value of the water conservation greatly exceeds the timber value from those same crops. And it just reminds us, in general, and I'm talking about rainforests here, but there's an economy to nature. Not just the global economy that you're all familiar with, but an economy to nature. And we don't value nature, which is why we don't protect it. And we need to start thinking about the values. And Mark Tercek, who's currently the president of the Nature Conservancy, but for years was a banker at Goldman Sachs. And he was one of the Goldman Sachs bankers that when Goldman went public, immediately was worth $80 to $120 million, depending on where you were in that. And he said, okay, I've done what I needed to do in the financial world. I'm now going out and I'm going to see what I can do to both protect and value nature. And he's just written a book that I haven't, it just came out on April 9th and I haven't read it yet, called Nature's Fortune. But I think it's interesting to have a banker, and a highly regarded banker, coming into this world and beginning to think, how do we value nature? And a lot of the development banks in the world, like the Inter-American Development Bank, is now calling the sorts of things that we do wild wealth. And it's what we have to think about. One of the remarkable things about being a scientist, or in fact a human in this day and age, is technology and the fact that we can really pull knowledge into action much faster than we have in the past. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do, and others like me are trying to do, is recognize that at the same time that we're sort of publishing our scholarly treatises, how can we pull knowledge into action very quickly? And so as I wind this talk down, I just want to give you a couple of examples of some other types of work we're doing. So brain miniaturization in insects. Why do we care about that? Well, we have insects that vary by 3 orders of magnitude, but they have to have the same behaviors. Find food, find mates, etc. How do they make their brains small and still carry forth those behaviors? We can learn. Leafcutter ants, oldest form of agriculture, 50 million years old, but unbelievably productive, it's hygienic. How are they doing it? What can we learn as humans about agriculture from ants? And then lastly, when you start to look at tropical forests and reefs, huge resource for pharmaceuticals. We've described more than 200 new compounds working with NIH for the last 12 years. And these are compounds that are not antifungal compounds, not antibacterial compounds, which people usually talk about. These are anti-cancer, anti-malarial compounds. They're showing incredible activity. And so these are other types of questions that we're addressing. And I'm going to close by just pointing out that we feel at STRI, and I think most academics feel, that you ask questions to move forward. And I'll just let you look at some of the different types of questions that we're on, so you know that it's not all applied. Really cool stuff about monkeys and their cheating. What he talked about, the rules of business. Crabs and how do they perform, and why do they have this weaponry? How do they use it to find mates? How do they use it to defend territories? We do lots of work on chocolate, rainforest fungi. Coral reefs in the Caribbean, many of you know, 80% of the reef cover is lost. And then finally, with climate change, are vines taking over the world? A host of questions. I'm happy to answer any or talk to you later about it, but thank you very much for listening.